The application came across my desk on a Tuesday morning in March at 9:47 a.m. between a refinancing request from a retired schoolteacher in Naperville and a small business line of credit for a flooring company in Elmhurst. It was a standard residential mortgage application, $412,000. Primary applicants, Raymond and Dolores Fontaine. Address, 1804 Creekside Drive, Aurora, Illinois. My in-laws. I sat with that file open on my screen for a long moment without touching anything. Then I picked up my coffee, took one slow sip, and read every single page from the beginning. Before I tell you what I decided, take a moment to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning if this is your first time here. And drop your city in the comments. I genuinely read everyone, and I love knowing where this community is listening from. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because the file on my screen that Tuesday morning was 3 years in the making. My name is Nadia Osei. I am 36 years old, and I am a senior loan officer at a mid-sized regional bank in the western suburbs of Chicago. I have held this position for 4 years, and before that, I spent 5 years as a junior loan officer at the same institution working toward it. I review mortgage applications, business loans, refinancing requests, and lines of credit. I assess risk. I approve or decline. My signature on a document means the difference between someone getting their house and someone being told to try again in 6 months. I do not make that decision lightly, and I have never once made it personally. Until the morning Raymond and Dolores Fontaine's file landed on my desk. I married their son Marcus 3 years ago. Marcus is a high school history teacher at a school 20 minutes from our apartment in Westmont. He is patient and funny and deeply principled in the way that the best teachers tend to be, and he loves his parents in the uncomplicated way of a man who has never had a serious reason not to. I fell in love with Marcus first and his family second, which is the order it should happen in, and for the first year of our relationship, I told myself the distance I felt from Dolores and Raymond was simply the normal friction of a new daughter-in-law finding her footing. I stopped telling myself that somewhere around year 2. Dolores was a retired nurse. Raymond had sold insurance for 30 years before retiring 2 years before I met Marcus. They were not unkind people in any obvious way. They did not say cruel things directly. What they did instead was something more difficult to name and considerably more difficult to address, which is why it lasted as long as it did. They talked around me in a particular way. Not over me, not past me, but around me, the way you talk around a piece of furniture that has been placed in a room where it doesn't quite fit. My job was the primary instrument of this. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual Sunday afternoon at the Creekside Drive house. My job came up in the same way and landed in the same place. Dolores would ask Marcus how things were going at school, and Marcus would answer, and then someone, usually Raymond, would say something in the direction of, "What about you, Nadia? Still at the bank?" And I would say yes, still at the bank, and Raymond would nod in the particular way that means he has already moved on from the topic before you finished answering. And the conversation would shift back to Marcus, to the school, to whatever the students were doing that week. Once, at Christmas dinner during our first year of marriage, I mentioned that I had just closed a particularly complex commercial loan. A deal that had taken 4 months of back and forth and involved a legal team and a property assessment dispute that I had helped mediate. Raymond listened to about 2 sentences of this and then said, "Well, it must be nice to have steady hours," and laughed and looked at Marcus, and Marcus smiled the smile of a man who does not know what to do with the space between the people he loves. Dolores had said, "Nadia, can you pass the green beans?" And that was the end of that conversation. A few months later, Marcus's cousin Bree, who worked in sales and had recently bought a new car, asked me at a family barbecue what exactly I did at the bank. When I explained, she tilted her head and said, "Oh, so basically like a bank teller but with more paperwork." I said not quite, and smiled, and walked away to refill my drink, which was something I became very good at over the years. Dolores had a phrase she used consistently when describing me to other people, and I know this because Marcus's Aunt Yvonne told me about it directly, with the slightly uncomfortable look of a woman sharing information she thinks you deserve, but wishes she didn't have to deliver. Dolores's phrase was, "Nadia works at a bank, office work. Nothing exciting, but it's steady." She said it the way you describe a sensible but unremarkable choice, like a safe and slightly dull pair of shoes. I never confronted this directly. Marcus and I talked about it twice, both conversations careful and slightly exhausting in the way of conversations where both people are trying to protect something at the same time. He said his parents weren't trying to diminish me, they just didn't fully understand what I did. I said I understood that. We both left those conversations feeling like we had said the right things and solved approximately nothing. What I did instead of confronting it was work. I am a meticulous person by nature, and I channeled that meticulousness into my career in a way that is probably the most honest thing I can tell you about who I am. I completed an additional certification in commercial credit analysis in my second year at the bank. I built a loan portfolio with a default rate 17% below the department average. I was named to the Regional Credit Committee 2 years ago, which meant my approval authority increased from standard residential mortgages up to $2 million in commercial credit. My branch manager, a precise and exacting woman named Carol, who does not give compliments casually, told me at my last performance review that I was the most thorough underwriter she had supervised in 12 years. I did not share any of this with Raymond and Dolores, not because I was hiding it, but because I had stopped expecting them to ask. In February of last year, Marcus mentioned at dinner one evening that his parents were thinking about moving. The house on Creekside Drive had become too large for 2 people since his sister moved to Portland, and they had found a smaller property they liked in a quieter neighborhood closer to Raymond's doctor. They needed to take out a mortgage to bridge the gap between selling the old house and closing on the new one. The amount they were looking at was around $400,000. Marcus mentioned casually that they were planning to go through our bank. Since Nadia works there, maybe she can point them to the right person. He said it in the easy tone of someone suggesting a useful shortcut. I said that sounded fine, and asked him to have them call the main branch number to start the application process. I said it naturally, and did not think much further about it that evening, because loan applications at our institution are distributed to officers by a rotation system based on loan type and officer availability. I had no reason to expect the file to come to me. The rotation system assigned it to me on a Tuesday morning at 9:47 a.m. I read the entire application twice. Raymond and Dolores's financial profile was in reasonable shape, better than I had expected, honestly, with steady retirement income from Raymond's pension and their combined Social Security, moderate existing debt, and a clean payment history. The property they were purchasing appraised well. On paper, this was a straightforward application. Under normal circumstances, I would have processed it efficiently and moved to the next file. These were not normal circumstances, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because it is the most important distinction in this entire story. I did not deny their loan. I did not manipulate the process. I did not do anything that a compliance review or an ethics audit would question for even a moment. What I did was slower and quieter and completely within the standard protocols of my institution. I flagged the file for a secondary review. This is a routine procedure. It means the application goes to a second officer for an independent assessment before a decision is issued. It adds time to the process, typically 1 to 2 weeks. It is used when a reviewing officer identifies any reason, professional or procedural, why an independent set of eyes would strengthen the integrity of the decision. I cited a standard procedural reason, a minor inconsistency in one of the income documentation forms that genuinely existed and that I would have flagged for any applicant. It was not fabricated. It was real. It simply was not the kind of thing that typically caused me to flag an application rather than resolving it myself. I then sent Raymond and Dolores a formal communication through the bank's standard correspondence system, informing them that their application was undergoing routine secondary review and that they should expect a processing timeline of approximately 3 to 4 weeks rather than the standard 2. The letter was professional and courteous and said nothing beyond what was procedurally accurate. Then I waited. Marcus mentioned it at dinner 4 days later. His mom had called him, a little confused about the delay. He said she had expected the bank to be faster, since they had a connection there. He said it without thinking about it, the way people mention things that seem small to them. I asked if she had said anything else. He said she had seemed a little flustered, but figured it was just bank bureaucracy. I said these things sometimes take a little longer and changed the subject to something about his week at school. The secondary review came back clean, as I had known it would. I approved the loan the following week. The Fontaines received their mortgage approval letter through standard channels, professionally formatted, with my name and title at the bottom as the approving officer, Senior Loan Officer, Nadia Osei. Marcus called me at work the afternoon his parents received the letter. He said his mom had called him and he could hear something in his voice that was trying to decide whether to be amused or something more complicated. She just called me, he said. She wants to know if you were the one who approved their mortgage. I said yes. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, she didn't know you could approve something that size. I know, I said. He was quiet again, a different kind of quiet this time. Then he said, she asked me why you never mentioned it. I told him I was never asked. He didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't need him to. Dolores called me directly that evening. I almost didn't answer, not out of avoidance, but because I was in the middle of making dinner, and the call felt like it deserved my full attention rather than half of it while I was managing a pot of rice. I turned the burner to low and picked up. Nadia, she said, and there was something in her voice I had not heard before, a tentativeness that did not sit naturally on her. I just wanted to say thank you for handling things, for the loan. I thanked her for calling and said it had been a straightforward application. Raymond and I didn't realize, she said carefully, that you handled that level of thing at the bank. We always thought you were more on the, well, she paused, the customer service side. I said I understood and let the silence sit for a moment before filling it. I said, I've been a senior loan officer for 4 years, Dolores. I approve residential mortgages up to $1.5 million and commercial credit up to $2 million. I've been on the regional credit committee for 2 years. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, well, Marcus never mentioned any of that. I said gently and without sharpness. He may not have known all the details. We don't talk about work that much at home. This was true. Marcus and I are both people who leave our jobs at the office as much as possible, because we both chose work we find meaningful and would prefer not to carry it through our front door every evening. What was also true, which I did not say to Dolores, was that no one in her family had ever asked me a question about my job that went deeper than still at the bank. She said she appreciated what I had done. I said, of course. We hung up and I went back to the rice, and Marcus looked at me from the couch with an expression I did not entirely know how to read. How did it go? He said. Fine, I said. She said, thank you. He nodded. Then he said, I'm sorry it took this long for them to understand. I told him it was okay and meant most of it. Raymond called 2 days later. His call was shorter than Dolores's and more direct, which is consistent with who he is. He said, "Nadia, I owe you an apology. We should have asked more questions a long time ago." I said I appreciated him saying that. He said, "You're good at what you do." I said, "Thank you, Raymond." He said, "Marcus is lucky." I said I knew, and that I thought the same thing about him. I did not cry on either of those phone calls, which surprised me a little. I had expected to feel more. What I actually felt was something quieter and more durable than the satisfaction I had imagined. It was less about being seen and more about having simply stopped waiting to be. Bree texted me the following week, which I had not expected. She said she had heard through the family that I was the one who approved the Fontaine mortgage, and that she had not realized what I actually did. She said, "I think I said something dumb at a barbecue once, years ago. I'm sorry about that." I wrote back, "It's fine, Bree. Really, because it was, by then." That was 7 months ago. The Fontaines closed on their new house in May, a smaller property in a quieter neighborhood closer to Raymond's doctor, exactly what they had wanted. I attended the small family celebration they held the weekend after closing. Dolores showed me the kitchen, which had the kind of wide windows she had always wanted, and she said, "We wouldn't be here without you." And she meant it in a practical sense, and possibly in a larger one too. I said the house was beautiful because it was. Raymond poured wine and gave a toast that included my name specifically, which he had not done at any previous family gathering in 3 years. I noticed it and I let myself feel it, and then I moved on, because that is what you do when the thing you waited for finally arrives later than it should have. You receive it and you don't make it smaller by needing it to be larger than it is. Marcus and I drove home that evening through the early summer dark with the windows down, and he held my hand across the console the way he does when he doesn't have words for something but wants me to know he's present. I didn't need words from him. I already had what I needed, which was the simple, permanent fact that my name, my actual professional title, the full weight of what I had spent 11 years building, had finally been in the same room as the people who had spent 3 years looking past it. I want to say something directly to you before I go, because I think this story is only useful if I'm honest about what it actually cost. I spent 3 years absorbing a version of myself that was smaller than the real one, inside a family that mattered to me because they mattered to someone I love. I did not fight it loudly. I did not confront it cleanly. I worked and I waited, and I told myself the gap would close on its own if I was patient enough. It didn't close on its own. It closed because a rotation system assigned me a file, and I chose to let the file be what it was, which was the truth about what I do, in a format that could not be redirected or minimized or turned into something easier to dismiss. I'm not telling you to wait. Patience is not a strategy. What I am telling you is this: the most powerful thing you can bring into a room full of people who have decided they already know what you are is the undeniable evidence that they were wrong, not loudly, not dramatically, just cleanly and specifically wrong. A file on a screen, a name at the bottom of a letter, $412,000 with your signature releasing it. That's enough. It has always been enough. Thank you for spending this time with me. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has someone in your life ever underestimated your professional value in a way that eventually corrected itself? Drop your story in the comments, even just a sentence. I want to read them. If this one stayed with you, hit subscribe and join us on The Quiet Reckoning. New stories every week about family, about value, and about the quiet moments when the truth finally catches up with the people who chose not to see it. Check the description below for another story I think will hit just as close. I'll see you in the next one. The morning after the Fontaine closing celebration, I went back to work as I always do, arrived at the bank at 8:30, made coffee, and opened the day's file queue. There were 9 applications waiting, a mix of residential mortgages and a small commercial refinancing. I worked through them the same way I work through every file, methodically, without shortcuts, giving each one the full weight of professional attention it deserved, regardless of who was on the other side of the paperwork. That is the part of this story that nobody sees, and that I think matters most. The quiet Tuesday mornings before any of the dramatic ones. The 11 years of building something real in a room where nobody was watching or asking or particularly interested. The certifications completed on evenings when I could have been doing something easier. The default rate 17% below average, not because anyone was keeping a specific score, but because the work itself deserved that level of care. I think about something Carol, my branch manager, said to me once during a particularly difficult quarter when I had flagged 2 fraudulent applications that had slipped through other officers' reviews. She said, "Nadia, the people who are truly good at this work are the ones who do it the same way whether anyone is watching or not." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she says most things, without the warmth people usually wrap around compliments to make them easier to receive. I've kept that sentence in the same mental folder where I keep the important things, the ones that don't need framing or softening to stay true. Raymond and Dolores hosted Thanksgiving last November, the first major holiday since the closing. I drove down with Marcus on a Wednesday evening, the car full of the things I always bring, a pie from the bakery Marcus likes, a bottle of wine I'd chosen carefully, the foil-wrapped dish of jollof rice that Dolores had asked me to make specifically, unprompted, which was the first time in 3 years she had asked me to bring anything to a family meal rather than saying, "Just bring yourself, hun, we have plenty." The table was full, Marcus's aunt Yvonne and her husband, Bree and her boyfriend, a quiet man named Patrick who made thoughtful observations and then let other people have the room, 2 of Raymond's cousins visiting from out of state. Dolores had cooked for most of the previous 2 days, and the house had the particular smell of a kitchen that has been continuously occupied, warm and slightly sweet and deeply familiar. Raymond gave the blessing before the meal, which he always does, brief and genuine. At the end of it, before people started reaching for dishes, he said, "And we're especially grateful this year for family who showed up when it counted." He did not look specifically at me when he said it. He didn't need to. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table, and I let him. And I looked at the jollof rice in the center of the table, golden and perfectly spiced. And I thought about how 3 years ago no one in this room had thought to ask me to bring it. Dolores seated me next to her this year, not at the far end where the extra folding chair lives, but in the chair directly to her right, which is where she puts the people she wants to talk to during the meal. We talked for most of it. She asked about the credit committee, what that actually involved, how decisions got made at that level. I explained it clearly and without making it smaller than it was. And she listened the way people listen when they are genuinely trying to understand something rather than simply waiting to respond. At one point she said, "I didn't realize how much judgment that requires." I said it's mostly pattern recognition, built over a lot of repetition, which is true, and which also didn't make it smaller. Before we left that evening, Dolores walked me to the door ahead of Marcus, who was still inside saying goodbye to Raymond's cousins. She stood with me in the entry for a moment, her hand resting on the door frame, and she said, "I want you to know I've thought about what I said to you on the phone, about always thinking you were on the customer service side." She said it carefully, the way people say things they have rehearsed slightly because they want to get them right. I told her I knew, and that it was behind us. She said, "It shouldn't have taken a mortgage approval letter for me to ask the right questions." I said, "Maybe not, but we're here now." She hugged me before I went out to the car. It was the first time she had done that without Marcus standing directly between us, without the occasion being a holiday greeting or a goodbye after a required family event. It lasted about 3 seconds, which is longer than a courtesy hug and shorter than an apology. I drove home thinking about those 3 seconds for most of the 40 minutes back to Westmont. I am not telling you this story has a clean ending, because it doesn't. Not in the way stories are supposed to when everything resolves and people become permanently different versions of themselves. Dolores and Raymond are who they are. They are people who built their understanding of the world through a particular lens, and that lens has limits, and those limits shaped how they saw me for 3 years. What changed is not the lens. What changed is that the thing they were looking at became impossible to see incorrectly. The paperwork made it impossible. And here is what I know about paperwork, professionally and otherwise. It does not care about assumptions. It does not adjust itself to fit what people expect it to find. It simply states what is true, in the clearest language available, and waits for the reader to catch up. I have been a senior loan officer for 4 years. I will likely be a branch manager within 2. My signature approves and declines financial decisions that affect people's actual lives, their homes, their businesses, their futures. I have known this about myself for 11 years. The only thing that changed on a Tuesday morning in March was that Raymond and Dolores Fontaine found out too. I hope you found something useful in this one. I hope it reminded you, even in a small way, that what you have built quietly in rooms where nobody was watching is still real. It is still yours. And at some point, if you are patient, and if you do the work, and if the rotation system of life assigns the right file to the right desk, the people who chose not to see it will have the opportunity to correct themselves. Some of them will take it. That is enough to go on.